Born in Homestead a few years back. I have this Yankee accent because at the age of 4, I was kidnapped by gypsies, Yankee gypsies, who spirited me off to live in the wilds of Michigan, where I was forced to milk cows and slop hogs, and where I suffered horribly from the cold until I was old enough to escape and return home to Florida. I tell you this because it is an example of what an old islander by the name of Jack Leffingwell would have called a romantic tale, neither fact nor fiction, but a combination of both. Some of the stories I'm about to tell you were written by Jack and published in the island's first newspaper, the Anna Maria Key News, in 1949 and 50. I must thank the editor of that paper, Ellen Bracken, for steering me to these stories. She is herself a fascinating lady and a friend that I have known for many years under her more recent name of Ellen Marshall. Thank you very much, Ellen. I'd like to point out the stories of haunted houses, however, are not the only tales I'll pass on to you tonight. Actually, the house ghosts did not surface, as it were, until the late 1960s and never appeared in Ellen's paper. These are only two of the many strange and wonderful tales that have had their origin in what is now called Bradenton Beach. My talk tonight will include stories of pirates and murder most foul, shipwrecks and buried treasures, and a hotel perhaps built from part of that treasure. Even stranger will be a story of island incorporation and petitions in favor of building bridges, for heaven's sakes. Then, of course, there are the haunted houses and some sex, although I'll try to keep that low-key considering the dignified nature of this audience. All these stories I incorporate under the title, Tales from the South Side. So, let us begin at the beginning. In the early 1800s, when Florida belonged to Spain, this area was the haunt of a vicious pirate by the name of Pascual Miguel. Pascual is said to have been a dirty, rum-swigging, murdering fiend, a counterpart of Jose Gaspar and possibly an associate of his. Old Miguel had several vessels under his command, but his flagship was a topsail schooner named Charon, after the character in Greek mythology who ferried the dead across the river Styx. Miguel was credited with many acts of brutality, but the most fiendish was the rape of the British brig Sunshine off the south end of Anna Maria Island in 1809. The Sunshine was sailing north during hurricane season, loaded with cargo and 28 passengers, including 13 women and children. She lay becalmed off the southern tip of the island when the barometer began to fall and the captain became concerned that a storm was approaching and he'd be washed aground. Then, as if by a miracle, a 10-oared longboat emerged from Longboat Key Inlet and offered to tow the ship to safety for 20 doubloons. The captain gratefully accepted, and the Sunshine was towed through the pass, then northward along the bay side of Anna Maria into the clutches of the waiting Charon. The unfortunate vessel, crew, and passengers were stripped of all valuables and beached near School Key, which you may know now as Key Royale. After McGill decided that none of the women, men, or children aboard were worth taking as slaves, he had them locked below decks, had 4 kegs of powder placed in and after deck, and the ship was set afire. There were no survivors. As a postlog to this story, 2 of Miguel's most important henchmen were English. Although they most certainly were blackguards, even they could not stomach a deed this foul to fellow Britishers and reported the incident to the British Crown. Some years later, during the War of 1812, these 2 British pirates trapped old Miguel at the mouth of Manatee River. They captured the Charon, hung old Pascual from the yardarm, locked his crew below decks, and set the ship ablaze. Again, there were no survivors. These guys played for keeps. Now there's a lot of story in this last one, but I can't tell you that tonight because that would have to come under the title of Tales from the North Side. After the appropriate demise of old Miguel, but before the purchase of Florida from Spain by the United States, there lived on the mainland a certain Spaniard by the name of Sanchez. He had 3 sons, and one of them settled on Anna Maria. One day, while fishing in the Gulf waters offshore from what is now the north end of Bradenton Beach, the sons found Spanish silver in a sunken ship. Since the wreck lay in fairly deep water, Sanchez waited for the most favorable tides and then retrieved an even larger cache of silver. He buried it in 2 locations, the larger amount in a shell mound in mid-island, which apparently was located near the north end of Bradenton Beach and the south end of Holmes Beach. And the smaller cache was buried 1,000 paces due west of the mound near the gulf between 2 palm trees. Old Sanchez must not have had total trust in his sons, however, because he didn't tell them the locations until he was on his deathbed. Immediately thereafter, one of the sons erected a house in the area and laid claim to the land, but he never found either treasure. Much later, during the Spanish-American War, a man by the name of R.E. Cobb visited Anna Maria while stationed in Tampa. After leaving the military, Cobb homesteaded a large tract on the island, the area where Sanchez's son had built his house. Although Cobb did not appear to have had much money when he came, in 1906 he built a large hotel, bar, and dance hall on the Gulf directly east of where the old treasure ship had been sunk. He named it the Clubhouse, and some said he got the $8,000 to build it from finding the smaller cache of buried treasure. If he did now, Cobb never admitted it, not even on his deathbed. In 1909, Cobb had his homestead surveyed, laid out streets and lots, and named it Ilexhurst. His dream of a grand development failed, however, because of the lack of a bridge to the mainland. The clubhouse later became known as the Gulf Park Hotel, and when the first bridge to the island was built in 1921, it became quite a favorite among islanders and tourists alike. I'm sure that Ellen remembers that, don't you? By 1950, about the time that I first visited Bradenton Beach, the property was rather seedy, but new owners were promising to restore the old hotel to its former glory. However, by the time I bought my home on the island in the late 60s, it had deteriorated considerably. It continued downhill from there on, sinking from a rocker hangout where once the Allman Brothers band played. Now you remember one of them was one of Cher's husbands, to a scroungy biker bar by the name of the Orr House, a bane to the residents of the Sandpiper Mobile Resort across the street. Finally, one night, it burned to the ground. Now, I might ask you, was it really faulty wiring that started that fire? Or a spaced-out hippie? Or possibly the ghost of old Sanchez's son getting revenge for a hotel being built on his land with his silver that he never found? Lord only knows. It could even have been a Zippo lighter owned by a mobile home resident across the street. At any rate, I don't believe it was merely a ghost that laughed and sang and danced in the streets of North Bradenton Beach that night, but who's to say, I for one had an alibi. An even larger development on the south side originated from the 1904 homesteading of 163 acres by David Roach to the south of Ilexhurst. In 1910, Wyman and Green, Manatee County's first authentic real estate company, purchased the Roach homestead and laid out a development named Cortez Beach, which appears to have been the actual legal name of Bradenton Beach, at least up until the post office was established in 1941. A man by the name of Sam Sawyer started a hardware store on Bradenton Beach right after the Cortez Bridge was built in 21. He named his store the Bradenton Beach Hardware Company. known as Uncle Sam because he looked, dressed, and acted the part. Sawyer had always brought the mail over from the post office in Cortez and claimed to have promoted the name Bradenton Beach for the new post office on the island 20 years later. Bradenton Beach still had not been incorporated by 1950, and there was a controversy about whether to incorporate the island as a whole, Bradenton Beach by itself, or just leave well enough alone. The anti-incorporationists apparently were centered in Ilexhurst, and in May 1950, the Anna Maria Key News came out with an article entitled, "Ilexhurst Secedes." In fact, the new directory of the island, published in November 1950, gave listings under the names of the city of Anna Maria, town of Holmes Beach, Ilexhurst, Mid-Island, and Bradenton Beach. Of course, Ilexhurst didn't get away with its secession and was later incorporated under Bradenton Beach. Where Mid-Island ended up, I'm not quite sure. Of course, when I first visited the island over the Christmas holidays in 1950, I had no idea about the controversy over incorporation. And I certainly didn't realize there were petitions circulating in favor of 3 new bridges. Had I known, I would have strongly endorsed the replacement of the old wooden bridge to Cortez because, frankly, I was not at all convinced we'd make it across before it fell in. And I think a lot of the rest of you felt the same way if you were here about that time. Also, I would have favored a new bridge connecting the mainland to the north. However, it might have been nice if we hadn't pushed for a 3rd. Well, hindsight's always 20/20. I just was thinking, though, going back, you know, it's interesting that the tin-oared longboat came from Longboat Key. That's kind of an interesting fact, too. Finally, we come to the haunted houses and to the sex. You'll notice I've saved the best for last. Some of you will remember an old, dilapidated 3-story cedar-shake house on the west side of Gulf Drive, about a block north of the Gulf Drive Cafe. It used to have an equally dilapidated sign out front that said, "Romaine's Unusual Gifts." That, of course, was the famous haunted house of Bradenton Beach. Now, Romaine Thomason was a nice lady. At least my mother says she was. And my mother should know, since she spent by far the most time around her, chatting and buying her silver and turquoise jewelry. But even Mom must admit that Romaine was a rather strange woman. Among other things, she felt the presence of ghosts. And she looked and dressed somewhat like a witch. In fact, my kids were absolutely convinced she was a witch. However, it wasn't Romaine who was really the weird one. That was her husband, Glenn. Glenn drank a lot. It was rumored that he eventually was banned from every bar in Bradenton Beach for making obscene remarks, among other things, to all the female staff and patrons at all the bars in town. Now, this is hard for me to believe. Not the part about the obscene remarks and other things. It's just that I personally believe there were bars in Bradenton Beach that would not have banned Pascual Miguel, or Attila the Hun, for that matter. But back to the house. The Thomasons claimed to have noticed something strange soon after they moved in. There were the dresses, all of a style of the mid-1800s, some stuffed in old brass sea chests, and others rotting on hangers in the 3rd floor closets. The previous owners of the house denied leaving any clothes behind, and the Thomasons claimed that the closets were empty when they looked at the house before buying. Also, there was the perfume, the almost sickly sweet odor of orange blossoms. These strange events are said to have coincided with the demolition of a water tower behind the house. Thomason surmised that the spirit had been living in the water tower, and when they tore down her resting place, she moved upstairs. He didn't say why she would have been in the water tower in the first place, but he did explain who she had been. Through a seance, he claimed that a young woman named Estrelita had boarded a ship out of Boston or Virginia. He was rather vague on that point. Bound for Manatee. She was coming to Florida, of course, to marry her childhood sweetheart. But on the way, her ship was hit by a sudden violent squall and it sank. Estrelita's body, clad in light gray, ankle-length suit, was never found. The Thomasons' son, Jer, was the only person who claimed to have actually seen Estrelita. He was sleeping in the third-floor bedroom one night when he felt someone watching him. Well, actually, she was doing more than just watching. She was bending over him, arranging the bedclothes. And would you believe, she was clad in a traveling suit of the mid-1800s and held a bouquet of orange blossoms. But then, Jer is said to have drunk also. The Thomasons claimed that other spirits later came into the house over the years that they lived there. There was a seafaring ghost who smoked a pipe and whistled. Glenn thought he might be a relative of Henry Curry, who built the house in 1923. Why, I haven't the foggiest. Glenn said perhaps he just wanted to be near the water. Then there was the ghost of Kelly Kenny, who claimed that she was Glenn's wife in a previous life. Glenn supposedly was a wild Irishman at that time, which was in 1846. She was jealous of Romaine and spoke only to Glenn. And as he is quoted to have said, most often when it's quiet and I'm sitting in the living room or at my desk just thinking, right, Glenn, just sitting there quietly thinking. The final spiritual guests were those of a child named Maria and her gentle Dalmatian, Domino. Now how about that for a romantic tale? It was considered of Estrelita, and apparently the other spirits, who had not made their presence felt when the Thomasons decided to sell the house and move on. The Thomasons did move on, but the house sat empty for a number of years after they left. It deteriorated to the point that part of it literally began to collapse and the house was condemned. Then a few years back, a young family bought the old house and began major renovations. After spending a great deal of effort and money, the old wreck started to really look nice. Unfortunately, the new owners replaced some of the old pilings, and the Department of Natural Resources took them to court and tied the house up in litigation where it is today. After sitting empty again for the past a couple of years, it is again beginning to deteriorate. It seems to be a real shame and a waste, but then perhaps the ghosts are happy about it. Frankly, I could never decide whether these spirits came from the dead or from the bottles. The lesser-known haunted house of Bradenton Beach happened to be my own. We bought our place in late 1968, but were not able to move down from Maryland until the summer of 1970. In the meantime, we rented the second story to a German woman who had married an American GI. Her husband was not around, but the renters downstairs soon informed us that other men were. Many different men, and always one or two at a time. This was about the time the first article on the Thomason house was written. Shortly thereafter, my folks sent us another clipping from a local newspaper. Sure enough, Frau Renter had decided that our house also was haunted. It was a very amusing article that ended something like this. So in Bradenton Beach, when they say, y'all come back, they really mean it, dead or alive. However, we decided that Frau Renter was after free publicity, and since our house really was not zoned for commercial use, we told Frau Renter to take her business elsewhere. We were told she decided to move back to Germany and join her sister, who had the distinction of being a professional prostitute, not merely an amateur. A few years later, after we had moved down here and were living in the house, a psychic of some sort appeared at our door, identified himself, and wanted to ask some questions concerning the spirit that supposedly haunted our premises. I was rather busy at the time, so I informed him that I was pretty sure that no self-respecting ghost would have stayed on in our house after we moved in with 4 kids and a dog. And if it had been stupid enough to stay, one of us would most certainly have set something heavy on it. He just looked at me for a moment, then he said, "I see what you mean," and left. And to this very day, we have never again been bothered by ghosts or psychics or by prostitutes, for that matter. We have heard noises in the attics at times, but those have been stopped after I put the cat up there. Now, this isn't really a very romantic tale to end with, and someday I might embellish on it a bit. But right now, my allotted time is over, and so I'll just say thank you very much indeed for listening, and are there any questions?